Welcome to A Lit Passage, Conversations in Reading and Living. I'm James Bubar. If you're new to the channel, please remember to subscribe. Your support really helps us grow our channel. This evening in Izmir and morning in Chicago, I'm honored to be joined by Dr. Raja Gopal Bhattar. Dr. Bhattar is a nationally recognized higher education leader, advocate, consultant, and author, most recently serving as the Assistant Provost and Executive Director of the Center for Identity and Inclusion at the University of Chicago. Raja holds a PhD and MA from UCLA and a Master of Higher Education from the University of Vermont. Certification and awards, even awards such as being recognized as a White House LGBT leader during a reception under President Obama, do not begin to cover Raja's art, activism, and scholarship. So we've provided a link below to learn more about Raja's work. Raja, I'm really excited to have you with us to talk about Coloring in Consciousness, a mindfulness coloring book for all ages. It's an amazing work, and I'm really glad you could take some time to talk about this new release of yours.
Thanks, James. I'm so excited to be here. Really, it's an honor, and it's a nice to reconnect with a friend from over a decade ago at this point. So it's great
Yes.
to be here. Thank you.
And who would have thought as we were working together on the campus of University of Redlands in California that I would be in Izmir, and now you're back in my hometown of Chicago. So,
You never know where the world will take us, right?
yeah. But before we begin talking about the book that's been released, it is available. We'll have a link to that as well. I just saw on your Instagram page today, I wanted to ask you about, you've produced masks with your artwork, handmade. And I didn't know if there was a social component or a donation component, or if they were still available, or it was a kind of, I'm just curious about if you could address that.
Yeah, thank you so much. So it's been, I'm not a self-described artist by any means at all. I know the last time I took an art class was in high school probably. But in COVID, as a consultant, I've been traveling quite a bit. So I travel and live out of my carry-on. But thanks to COVID, I ended up in Chicago and ended up in one place for longer than 3 weeks. And
Yeah.
so in this process, I know I've always been a doodler, so I started doodling and things just kind of manifested. And so even the Coloring Consciousness book just kind of, it was not a planned thing. It just kind of manifested by itself, I think. And then from that, I realized a couple of friends were like, well, why don't you make masks? And I was like, how do I don't know how to do this. This is not, I'm good at ideas and vision. I'm not always good at the execution because I don't necessarily have I'm not a detail oriented person in that way. But thankfully there's enough links and resources and online spaces to where they will actually do the hard work of making things. You just have to upload things.
Right.
And for me, it's like everything that I do has to be connected to making a difference for a broader world. It's not just making
Yes.
money for myself or I
Yes.
think social capitalism is better than just capitalism.
Yes.
And so the masks that are being made right now, 20% of all the profits will actually go to Black Lives Matter and particularly work that's supporting Black trans people
That's
in
great.
the U.S. because they are an underserved population that is at higher risk for violence, harm, etc. And so I, as a brown queer person,
Hmm.
I wanted to make sure that I'm doing something, and though I might not be able to always be in the front lines or do have huge waves of impact, I can at least do something to support the people that are doing that on the front lines.
Yeah, well, that's great. And so we'll make sure we have a link for people who want to pick up some of those masks. I mean, they're beautiful. And I love the one that says it's black and it says in white, if you can read this, you're too damn close. All right, that's perfect.
Exactly.
But I would need one in Turkish, but it's great.
We can work it out.
Okay, great. I'll make sure people who can everyone's going to be picking those up. So it's great that it goes to such good causes. And I'm really struck by the fact that you talked about yourself not necessarily as an artist per se, but a kind of COVID-born doodler who had something to offer and offered this coloring book, which is they're beautiful images.
Thank
And
you.
can you talk a little bit more about that journey? Is the aesthetic that appears in your artworks, is that something you've always been interested, maybe aesthetically or intellectually, or from encounters with artwork or heritage or whatever influence? and then it came together in this time. Like now I'm gonna
Yeah.
doodle more, or like what was that transition from a scholar, a mentor, an activist to producing a coloring book that is making a difference really in people's lives who engage it?
Yeah, no, that's a beautiful question. Thank you. I think for so much of my life, it's been so much of my personal and professional passion have been driven by my family being an immigrant and coming from immigrants, and really trying to uphold the quote unquote American dream of getting the doctorate, having a job, buying a
Yeah,
home, just all doing all the checkboxy things,
yeah,
right?
yeah. And you did all
And
those,
I did all those,
and then
and
COVID
literally
happened.
exactly. So, a year ago, I decided to leave my job and I decided to put my stuff in storage and live out of a carry-on suitcase. And so, really trying to embrace the natural vagabondness that's always been a part of my own personal identity,
Right,
but that's always
right.
been thwarted by familial expectations and
Yeah,
cultural
yeah.
expectations.
The
Um,
script, the script.
Exactly.
Hmm.
And so I think I've always been artsy and creative. I was in
Hmm.
theater in high school. I've been a musician. I love to cook. I love to decorate. Like those have all been things that I've always loved to do.
Hmm.
But art has always been something that's always been like something that other people do that I get to enjoy and embrace, but not something that I do myself.
Hmm.
Um, and yet, coming from Indian culture and particularly Hindu spiritual culture, there is such an important practice around art and art making and
Yes,
meditation.
yes.
Um, and so I have also, in addition to having been brought up in a traditional Hindu family, I have been following Thich Nhat Hanh, who's a Vietnamese Buddhist monk
Yes,
based out of
yes,
France and
yes.
Vietnam, who was, in asylum from the Vietnam War.
Hmm.
But really, the simplicity of mindfulness and the ability to just find joy in everything that we're doing. Um, that's been important to me for the last dozen years or so. But especially during COVID, I noticed that I needed something to just help me ground myself so I wasn't just freaking out about the uncertainty that's all around us.
Right.
And when it looks like everything around us is crumbling down. And
Yes.
I found that just being able to sit and meditate on doodling has been really helpful.
Yeah.
And so that's really where a lot of the art came from. Like there's not really a plan to my artwork that I do. I start off with some basic shapes,
Hmm.
and I usually do a meditation, and usually whatever comes, whether it's an image or a shape or
Wow.
form or idea, kind of
Wow.
starts with that, and I just let it kind of go where it goes. And it's
Wow.
been fun to even try to learn how to record some of that process because I think if you
Yeah.
watch the videos, you'll see there's not a linear process, and I'm not a
Right.
linear thinker.
Right.
But it's really about helping. It's almost like being a sculptor, allowing the sculpture itself to unveil itself. And
Yes.
so I was doing a little bit of these things, and as a challenge to my own perfectionism, because I'm like, if it's not perfect, you shouldn't put it out there. I was like, let me just put it on Facebook and Instagram just to like
Yeah.
force myself to be okay with not being
Yeah.
perfect
Yeah.
and not wanting to fix everything.
Yeah.
And so then people were like, "Oh, this is really cool." And so then I started getting people just like being like, "Oh, your artwork is really good. Like it's actually you have something there." And this is again not at all anything that was intended, but I realized like, "Oh, this is kind of cool. People are actually interested in this." And then I was like, "Well, how do I transform this into something that other people want can do something with?" And then a friend
Yes.
of mine, Dr. Bobby Kuntzman, had the idea of he was like, these art pieces are beautiful. I'd love to color them, but also like, can you incorporate your mindfulness because that's such an important part of
Right.
how you create this art. And so
Right.
we actually each image actually has a prompt on the backside to
Wow.
help people actually think through not just the image and coloring, but actually like
Hmm.
why are we coloring? What does this particular image mean to me? And to actually be able to incorporate values of mindfulness that isn't necessarily spiritual or religious, but really just around healthy living practices,
Yeah.
particularly for this pandemic. And so then it just came together, and really it's been, I think the name itself for me was this idea of coloring in consciousness, both that you're coloring in the process of being mindful, but also you're
Hmm.
coloring in an image that's helping you gain that consciousness.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so that's kind of really how it came about. It was not at all planned, but I'm really happy with the way it's been being received in the last, I mean, it's been available for less than a month. I think I've sold over 150 copies.
Yeah. Well, it's a great. I think it's very inspirational, even beyond the work and the offering you're giving to people, but just at this time when people are being disrupted for whatever
Right.
reason. You can't travel, or you're worried about employment, and you being able to look around, kind of connect with something you've always loved, and then make it visible and offer it and create it. That life is still coming even in this time that is very disruptive to us. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about mindfulness because unfortunately I haven't been able to get the book yet because of it's a little slow here right now in terms of the
Sure.
post. Although Turkey's been handling everything really well, they've done a great job, but things are slow all over the world. But I wanted to talk a little bit about this notion of mindfulness, and I'm a big fan of Thich Nhat Hanh as well, especially his how-to series. Have you read that?
Right. Oh, I
They're
love those.
amazing. Oh my, and
Yeah.
in a matter of fact, when I saw your images start to appear, and particularly of the book, and then I went on Amazon, which shows you can look inside. Um, I don't want to embarrass you, but I was struck with the simple beauty in the same way I was struck with his words in those books. You
Oh
know,
my gosh. Thank
those
you. I mean that's super humbling because as my spiritual teacher, I think I actually have a quote of his in the credits page
amazing,
because
amazing.
that is for me it is such an important. What I love about his work is it's so simple
Yeah.
and yet so profound, and I think that
Yes.
was exactly what I was trying to go
Yeah.
for with this too. So I appreciate that you got that.
Yeah. In fact, I think about once a summer, I would take one with me, and how to walk or how to
Uh,
sit, and
how
I,
to
st-
eat is
I,
my
st-
favorite.
yeah, I still remember. I live in a very Izmir has a lot of hills, a lot of stairs. Not as bad as San Francisco, but similar. And I think it's in How to Walk where he talks about if you encounter every stairway that you encounter, just stop, clear your mind, and just do nothing but walk up the stairs. So he's
Right.
so. I mean, he writes it better than I'm explaining it, of course, but it's that power, almost in that Zen sense of just you're stopped by the beauty and the simplicity. And I remember being on my couch in this kind of coronavirus torpor, not having slept well and kind of worrying too much. And I first came across your book, and I had a similar feeling, and I felt like I need two. I had this. I was like, I need two, and I have to be like Leonardo da Vinci with two hands coloring. So it was really, I think your book is I mean, people are going to, I think, respond to it because they need this process in some way, which gets me to my question about mindfulness. Because often it's amazing, you know this as someone who's been in higher education and you've kind of lived the American dream. The dominant corporate capitalist culture in America co-ops everything. And so
Right.
even mindfulness is coming into that net. And so people are like, be mindful so you can then get a higher paying job, or be
Right.
mindful so then you can do more with your days. And it's become more of like working out. But that is probably not the mindfulness you mean in the book. So that experience you're going for and the mindfulness you're trying to elicit, could you talk about that as a process related to your book and the act of coloring in?
Yeah. Yeah, I think again, mindfulness has become, like you said, a co-opted experience, similar to yoga, similar to so many other
Right.
practices.
Meditation.
In exactly. I think for me, what I love about mindfulness is that it isn't about a religious practice or putting on a bead of mala beads or going to yoga. It's not. But it's about finding joy and presence in the things that you already do.
Wow.
One of my favorite quotes by Thich Nhat, actually two of my favorite quotes by Thich Nhat Hanh. One is, washing dishes. I'm not a fan of washing dishes.
Yes.
I love cooking, but the cleaning I'm not a fan of because it's just
Yes.
too much work.
Yeah.
But he says, it's like if you can see the baby Buddha in every bowl that you wash, then
Right.
you find mindfulness.
Yes.
And that has transformed for me the way I do dishes, and
Right. Right.
it's sometimes just autopilot, right? Because you're like doing 7 million things in your brain while you're trying to wash. But even just that slowing down of like, oh, if this was a baby Buddha that I'm washing, would I actually be so careless?
Yes.
And what a cool privilege and what an incredible experience to be able to actually wash this bowl. How many people in the world can actually do that?
Right.
And that goes to so many different layers, and it can go to
Right.
just the level of like I have a bowl to wash, to I have fresh water, to I have electricity, to I
Right.
have
Right.
I'm alive, to I have hands, to it can go
Yeah.
we can go as meta or as micro as you'd like.
Yeah.
And then the other piece is, I drink tea. I'm allergic to coffee, so I drink a lot of tea, which is why I loved being in Turkey because it was just like you can drink
Yes.
tea any
Yeah.
time of day, and it's super strong. But he also says, drink your tea, drink your clouds,
Yes.
because it
Yes.
reminds us that the water that we are drinking is the same water that we see in the clouds. And so this
Yes.
interbeing, though I might not be drinking the actual cloud, without the cloud, the tea would not happen. Without the tea, the cloud would not happen. And I'm in between and
Yes.
part of and outside of all of those things. And so
Yes.
that really helps me also remember that like this interconnectedness, which is I think why
Mm-hmm.
for me the need to share this art is really important, because it's not just about doing something for myself,
Mm-hmm.
but allowing for, because if I can help other people heal, then they can help me heal. If I and but
Yes.
my intention is not to do it for them. My intention is for my own healing when I
Right.
make this art.
Yeah.
But then putting it together and sharing it also reminds me. My mother once told me, get a education, because that's the one thing that they can't get away from you. And
Right.
I would maybe add, it's also the one thing that you can share without losing anything.
Yes.
You can give away
Yeah.
knowledge without losing anything.
Yeah.
And so how beautiful to be able to do that, and how to actually so for me, that mindfulness has come in being able to see the interconnectedness of our struggles, but also has
Mm-hmm.
allowed me to have compassion for everything from the Black Lives Matter movement that's happening to the people that are losing their lives and don't have access to healthcare due
Right.
to just lack of federal oversight
Yeah.
and infrastructure,
Mm-hmm.
to people that are struggling to make sense of what it means to be white in the US right now, and
Mm-hmm.
how to actually recognize the privilege that comes with that.
Yeah.
And for me as a brown immigrant queer person,
Mm-hmm.
how do I fit into all of those, and how are we intertwined and entangled in this messiness? And I think a previous part of me was taught to say, okay, I just have to undo that and I'll be fine.
Yeah.
But I think, with meditation practice and even in all this chaos, what mindfulness has taught me is actually it's embracing the chaos is what actually the healing is about, and not
Yes.
resisting it.
Yes. And trying to figure out, as you so beautifully described, how to find yourself separate from the role or
Hmm.
the script, even if you're self-generating those
Right.
expectations. But what I really like about the act of coloring, and particularly with your book, because of the images that you can color in, is your artwork is not finished. It's an offering, and then it'll never be finished the same way twice. And so
Right.
I've spent a lot of time thinking about it since I saw your book released. And at first I thought about this, well, maybe what you're doing is a more accessible, personal connection to the mandala practice. But then
Hmm.
I was like, that's not right in a way, because in mandalas, usually you're dealing with centuries old, traditional. So you're
Sure.
feeling, and they're incredible sand paintings,
Sure.
but
Sure.
this is something that was offered by you,
Right.
unique, unique. And then I started thinking, well, maybe it's like when Walter Benjamin, the scholar, says you should write your favorite author's sentences, like literally copy out the
Mm.
sentences. And he wasn't
Mm.
so much talking about mindfulness, but more of a getting into the author, getting into the work in a way. And I said, but again, that's different, because this isn't really what the person's doing, because they're adding their own color, their own texture, their own. So they're not just following your work, of course.
Sure.
And then you'll be happy to know that then I came along the idea of the labyrinth, thinking of the
Oh yeah.
labyrinth that was at the University of Redlands where we both worked. I thought, well,
Uh-huh.
maybe that's it, because the labyrinth maker made this pattern, and then you walk in reflecting on things with your life as you work into the center and work out. So this is very a labyrinthine practice, but I don't think any of those gets to this notion of the co-creation that
Mm.
coloring provides. And with that level of the prompt for mindfulness, it takes it beyond the aesthetic or beyond the paper, so to speak. You're really co creating a moment that was started, like you talked about with Thich Nhat Hanh, many, many miles or many hours away from the moment you're coloring it. And there's
Sure.
this sense of interconnected co creation and bringing something new into the world, besides the coloring, but the feeling or the non feeling, you might say, of mindfulness. And I was just wondering how, if did you just finish this and move on? Or have you thought about what this meant now that it's a book and in the world, like what this coloring is
Yeah,
as it
I
relates to
appreciate that you think
mindfulness?
that I'm so intentional, that I had that much forethought, because there was
No, I
no
didn't
forethought.
necessarily say intentional. It's more like
Right.
afterthought. Like
There
now
you
that
go.
you have this, I'm like,
Yeah, no,
what is really going on here?
Right. No, I love this. For me, it is the co-creation that's been really beautiful, right? To see whether it's a 72-year-old friend in Colorado or a 6-year-old niece
Right.
in Boston, to be able to actually see how they interpret these same images has been pretty amazing. Partially because these are, for me, in some ways, these are extensions of myself, right? Because especially like the first image in the book is an elephant,
Yes,
and I
I
love
saw
elephants.
that.
It's one of my favorite animals.
Yeah.
But also in the Hindu tradition, you always start with the god Ganesha, who's
Right.
the elephant-headed god,
Hmm.
because you start. So for me, it's about there's a spiritualness that's
Hmm.
grounded in me that I was like, and that piece was the last piece that I drew because I was
Wow.
putting all the other because after like 15 pieces I was like, okay, I should do something, I got to put it together. And as I was putting it together, I was like, oh, I think it's done. I was like, something is missing. My heart was telling me something was missing. And I sat down, like, and within like 2 hours, it just this elephant just happened. And like
Wow. Two
I've ever
hours.
drawn,
2 hours.
yeah, exactly.
I shouldn't have been watching Netflix. I could have. Should have. I got the. That's
And
that alone is enough for this talk, because if you can produce that in 2 hours, I mean, it's incredible. That's one of the most detailed pieces. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. And it was interesting because I was like, I also was like, there was like pieces in it that I was like, it's not perfect. There's a couple of like edges that don't work. It's not. It wasn't planned out. There was no because it's just not how I work. And yet it's been beautiful to see how other people like people have actually sent me images of what they've how they're
Beautiful.
coloring the elephants.
Yes. Yes.
And that actually like there was one that just made me cry because it was just so beautiful beyond what I even thought possible.
Yeah.
And so I do appreciate this idea of this co-creation of, and for me, that's it's the co-creation of healing, right? Because elephants are
Right.
so much about wisdom and healing and being intentional in everything that we do and knowing that there's a higher purpose.
Hmm.
And there's a sense of community, right?
Hmm.
Elephants are all about community
Hmm.
and remembrance. And so for me, there was something beautiful as I'm seeing these images. A friend of mine, Dr. Lorena Marquez, she supports and she's an incredible educator in California. She was doing an Upward Bound program the
Wow.
last couple of weeks, and she actually had some of her students utilize that piece
Wow.
as part of their one of their class activities. And so then she sent me a picture of just her screen
Wow.
zoom full of these images, and just to see a herd of elephants that had been colored that just came out because of this process, and the fact that it has been able to be a source of their own kind of conscious and inspiration,
Mm.
and the fact that it has a life of its own. The elephant has a life of its own. It's having a journey of its own, and that's
Right.
pretty beautiful for me.
Yeah, it's always unfinished. And I was curious about your source for the prompts. Were they like were you? I know you dedicated or mentioned Thich Nhat Hanh. You said in the beginning of the book, but were the prompts something that you thought up that you would come up with, or from teachers of mindfulness practice, or where'd you pull them from? Because a really cool layer that I haven't seen the book yet, unfortunately. But I was curious
Yeah,
about
I
where
will
you
send
came
you a
from
couple
that.
of digital images so just so you can see it.
Oh, cool.
But no, it's a collection. So there's a couple of quotes from Thich Nhat Hanh, just because for me that
Of
is
course. Of
the
course.
source of
Yeah.
mindfulness,
Yeah, of
And I was
course.
like, I can't not include my
Right.
spiritual teacher
Right.
in because even when I was doing some of these pieces, there was just things that would come to me.
Yes.
And then there's even some music lyrics in there as well. There
Beautiful.
are some. There's a quote. Bu- um, about environmentalism. There's a quote around.
Right.
There's actually one of the other pieces in there. There's only a couple of animals in there. One is a snake and the other is an elephant.
Mm.
And for me, the snake has always been an important spiritual animal, partially
Yep.
because it's so misunderstood in the Western
Of
tradition, and
course.
yet in so many traditions, it's spiritual and
Yeah.
actually represents transformation.
Yeah.
And at
It's the
first, I
it's
noticed
the
that
only animal that gives birth to itself every month. Well,
exactly.
not every month,
Uh,
but sheds its
but yeah,
old to become shiny.
exactly.
Yeah.
And yet so when I thought about putting it in, I was like, first I was fearful because I was like, there's such a Western Christianness to snakes, and I was like, but to me they're actually about healing and transformation and
Yeah.
your ability to actually
Hmm.
transform. So then I was actually like, let me find some quotes that are actually around
Hmm.
transformation and the ability to actually create yourself and recreate yourself and make that an intentional healing process. And
Yeah.
so then that became part of what went with that quote. And then there's other ones that are just like, I think this picture reminds me about this garden that I've
Oh,
that's beautiful for
interesting.
me. So the
Interesting.
question is gonna be about this a
Yeah.
garden. Like, what is the garden that you want to create for
Yeah.
yourself?
So the prompts themselves as a collection take on this kind of, I don't know, complex, I mean, collection of things that have inspired you in your work with mindfulness from all the different sources. That's pretty cool. Uh, the other
Yeah.
the other thing I wanted to talk about a little was the title. And as you know, my background is literary theory and writing, and I'm still obsessed with the coloring and consciousness title. Because
Yeah.
on the one hand, it's very Derridian. It means multiple things at the same
Right.
time. So
Right.
on the one hand, it's coloring in consciousness. So consciousness is like the medium. That's the color, you're working
Right.
with, right? Like the end of the
Right.
brush.
Right.
But on the other
Right.
hand, getting back to Thich Nhat Hanh, it's like the water is filling consciousness.
Right.
So it's a subject. I thought it was
Yeah.
really, it's both object and subject. And so I'm
Exactly.
curious about if that was something you had thought about in coming up with the title.
Yeah, I went back and forth quite a bit with the title, and first it was going to be something else like mindful coloring for everyone. Then I thought about coloring with consciousness, and I was like, that didn't feel because it was like it
Yeah.
still felt separate from the coloring and the consciousness.
Yes.
But I love the idea of like coloring it in, and like the fact that the consciousness is in the coloring, and the
Yep.
coloring is in the consciousness.
Yep.
And I really like the fact that that equation was just. Um, Inseparable, and I think for
Yes.
me that got to
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
mindfulness value of like this
Yeah.
interbeing, and this ability that if we notice, everything is on purpose, everything has a purpose,
Hmm.
and everything can be we can find the connectedness of all of us, right? It's
Yeah.
like the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, but in a spiritual practice.
Yeah.
And so that's so for me, it was something that was it was a playful, cheeky language, but
Right.
also as a deeper meaning. So people, if it
Yes.
was a 3-year-old reading it versus a 7-year
Right.
old, they can read different levels into it. I think also I tried to frame the book itself and the prompts in ways that like people of all ages could find whatever it is that they need to find out of it.
Yeah. And it's not, you can't resolve it. It
Right.
doesn't end up on subject or object. It's constantly, I don't know, it's a constantly happening. It's a constantly happening ambiguity that you're
It's an action
participating
verb.
in. Yeah.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
coloring, and it's not coloring conscious. It's coloring because it requires us to actually do
Right.
something.
Right.
And I really appreciate that it
Yeah.
takes initiative.
Yeah. But it's both the medium and the vessel.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's they're not. And I'm thinking about when you think of mindfulness, it's amazing how fast you come up with images of mindlessness that we're all
Right.
guilty of, whether, especially now, scrolling or going up the TV, the 300 channels, or just scrolling on your phone, and 5 minutes go by and you're like, I haven't even looked at anything.
Right.
So there's this relation between the mindfulness in coloring. You can't do that with
Right.
coloring. And the
Right.
mindlessness that comes to us all too
Right.
easily. But you can't do that with the act that you are encouraging with your work. It
Yeah.
almost has to be
I can,
mindful.
right. If I can share one quick
Of
story,
course, yeah, please.
part of the so I also do a huge moon series and celestial series, and so
Yes.
for me, moons are just really important. Partially because in my family, we come from the lunar calendar in Hindu tradition, so that's important to me.
Yes.
And I'm named after this Hindu god Krishna, who is the essence of the moon.
Yeah. No
And
pressure. No
so,
pressure there. Having
no
done
pressure,
that.
no. But I remember actually sitting, I'm thankfully house sitting for a friend of mine in Chicago, and so I was sitting at like 2 in the morning. I'm sitting here, I'm looking at the sky, and I see this beautiful full moon that just is like radiating just energy. And it made me think about that was for me, there's just like, there's so many things you can see in the moon, but like it's all shifting and moving and like, but but it still feels still, right? It's the
Right.
stillness and movement all at the same time.
Yeah.
And so then I just sat down and I just started doodling, and I literally took a plate and I just put it on the piece of paper, traced a circle, and that became my full moon. And even
Wow.
now, that's like I use a plate or like other round things, just product, various objects that I've found to be able to create these shapes that allow me to then create whatever comes out of it. And so what I've really enjoyed is that moon for me was the inspiration for a whole full moon series, because I was like, there's so much happening in the moon that we don't even realize, and yet there's also a connectedness, and that the moon is shaping things that we see and feel,
Yes.
and all the energies, and yet
Right.
how often do we actually think about it? And
Yes.
so so for me, I think my goal was to then create this introspective moon where I was trying to like help the moon itself find what's happening within itself. And so some of these different gardenscapes that are, for me, the full moon series are about like, if I were the moon, what would be happening within me? And so that's, for me, it's just like it's embodying of, again, the interbeing, but also this process of becoming that's a never
Yes.
ending.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And I think besides this, the work of mindfulness that you're connected to, of course, you also seem to be coming at a time when people are kind of over all of the digital engagement. You know,
Mm.
there's a return to writing letters. There's a return to reading the books, not just the screens, and so there is this revival of thingness that
Hmm.
we feel like we really need. And so getting the pencil, or you mentioned the plate when you're creating it, but just someone coloring your book, having the pencil, having the space, this is the ritual and the feel to it, the touchiness in this rapidly virtualizing and digital world, I think is needed now more than ever, beyond in itself, not just in the practice of the mindfulness. And I was curious if you thought that there's a lot of these books becoming available, not necessarily in mindfulness, but I know I went to the Hermitage, I go every year,
Oh
and
yeah.
there's now a coloring book of all the great works there. So there seems to be this human need that the screens aren't enough. This is great what we're doing, but watching screens and listening to just everything, from virtual and clouds, it's not enough. And I'm curious if in your relationship with developing the work or in the educators who are using some of these tools, if you're seeing that reflection as well in behavior nowadays with younger people, or I mean anybody really.
Yeah, I'm especially with the just the Zoom upswell of everything and anything being on Zoom, from family time to happy hours with friends to birthdays to work, like everything is just on Zoom. So there's
Yeah.
no real need to put on pants for most of the days, right? Uh, um,
Wait, do you have a
so there,
do you have a camera in here? How'd you know I'm not late?
I have my ways, James. Um, no,
It's the third
so
eye.
I,
It's the third eye,
right,
right, Raja?
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So for me, there's been, I've always loved books, and there's something about like reading a book in physical print versus like reading on a digital screen that just doesn't do it for me.
Right.
Because I just love being able to actually like play with it and like
Yeah.
put a
Yeah.
dog earring and sing a
Underline
note.
and like yeah.
Yeah. Or
Yeah.
like going back to like sitting like for me like Thich Nhat Hanh books, right? It takes me like 10 years to get through one of those damn
Oh,
things. So like I sit with
yeah.
one like, wow, that's so profound and yet so simple. How do I make like what am I missing? Because there's often this fear of like not getting something, but then
Yeah.
also like not judging myself for that too,
Right.
right? And
Right.
so just being able to like sit with it. And so I wanted to create something that was a physical, tangible thing.
Hmm.
Once I actually got to a point of feeling like other people wanted to do this with me as well. And I've even like sent out original copies to people because I'm like, okay, here you go. Because in some ways it was about helping to let go of um, the attachment to that art piece, right? And feel like it doesn't have to be perfect the way I'm gonna do it. That someone else you could do it and it'd be perfect because it's perfect for you. Um, and I even decided to not put it on Kindle and the digital version because I was like, I don't want this to be another experience for people to just do a coloring on a screen. While that's great for some people in terms of accessibility, it also just takes away from actually the feeling of, like you said earlier, the being
Hmm.
in that space and in that moment, actually like picking up a color pencil and actually being like, what color am I gonna like? What does that look
Right.
like? And just be able to
Right.
not just say I'm gonna pick whatever millions of colors I can choose because I can, to like, no, this is the 12 colors I have. Okay, this is what I'm gonna
Hmm.
use, and it would actually be okay with that moment of being and presence. I think is helpful. Um, and then the other piece for me is actually so I've been putting all my artworks. I invested in a scanner and I've been scanning it and then putting it into a hard drive.
Hmm.
Lo and behold, 4 days ago, the hard drive broke. Uh,
Oh.
and
Oh.
I had this moment of sadness and mourning because I was like, can I even get this back? I'm like, it's so much freaking work.
Right.
Uh, but
Rescan.
I
Yeah.
also then I was like, I had gotten attached to the digital version
Right.
in trying. So it was like this universal
Yeah.
message of like, okay, it's just like I will figure it out, right? And so thankfully, I was able to go through some random programs that I had used and actually found some backed up images, which then I used to make the masks and stuff. But
Hmm.
it taught me even in trying to be mindful, it's so easy to get attached to everything.
Yeah.
And so it
Yeah.
felt like the universe be like, nope, you need to just slow down a little bit and like
Yeah.
just be
Yeah.
okay with the paper and not create for the project. Because then
Yes.
people have been like, oh, when are you gonna do your second book? And now I feel this pressure because at the first time there was no
Yes.
pressure, but
Yes.
now it's like, well, what is it gonna be? How is it gonna match the first book? Um, and so it's also been this interesting spiritual practice of letting go of that expectation and allowing the art to create itself and not control it.
Right, and not be creating layers of desire, as the Buddhists would say, to be connected
Exactly.
to. And I know you have to go. We're already running a few minutes over. We're going to let you go in a few minutes. Thank you so much for your time. But I was wondering, because of your Hindu spirituality, and mindfulness often is talked about as coming from the Buddhist tradition, but if you could talk a little bit about that connection to, maybe it's not called the same, but I know how important ritual and story is to the Hindu tradition. So do you see it a cognate in there about, in that context, that maybe
Yeah.
helped fuel your understanding of the process of embracing just being in the moment and
Yeah.
letting go of a lot of chains that we construct? So I'm curious
Yeah.
about that from a Hindu perspective.
Yeah, that's a beautiful question. I think for me, so much of the ritual that I was taught as a kid was like, you just do this because you're supposed to do it and because I
Yeah.
tell you to.
It's
And I
external.
was always like, yeah, I was always the kid that I was like, why? And so my parents would get just annoyed with me because I was like, why do we do this? Why do we do that? And I remember some of the rituals that I value the most from when I was growing up. I come from about 20 generations of Hindu spiritual leaders, going
Wow.
back to ancient times in India.
Amazing.
My great uncle was the first in the U.S. post 1965 to consecrate a Hindu temple, and so
Wow.
and most temples in the U.S. have someone that's either related to me or is somehow connected to my family. And
That's
so I grew
incredible.
up in temples for most of my life, and as a teenager, I remember at some point my dad had started teaching me how to do the decorations and the services and stuff. But
Hmm.
I really enjoyed the artistic elements of
Hmm.
decorating each of the statues. There was like 20 different statues in the
Yes.
temple, and it wasn't just like you just put a cloth on them, but you have for me to actually like
Yes.
I would actually have for me like that's where I learned the power of spirituality and mindfulness. I would
Yes.
sit by myself at 3 in the morning decorating these statues,
Yes.
and I would actually talk to the gods. And it might
Yes.
sound weird, but
Yeah.
I could actually feel the energy of whether or not they liked it. And if they
Yeah.
liked it, then I would leave. If not, I would actually take off everything that I'd just done for the last 2 hours and just do it
Wow.
all over again.
Wow.
Until I felt like I could feel the joy from the statues and the divinity coming through,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? And
Wow.
so for me, I think that idea of the ritual of being able to do follow the my gut feeling
Hmm.
and knowing when it's enough to
Hmm.
stop and knowing when it's okay to just throw it all away and do it all over again.
Yeah.
And so I think that piece of the trusting the gut, I think, is definitely connected to my Hindu spirituality and those ideas of rituals and the voices are always there. It's whether or not we choose to listen to them.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
and I think for me, in the Hindu tradition, it was often an external voice that I would hear from these external
Hmm.
statues and beings
Hmm.
as a reflection of my own energy. In the
Hmm.
Buddhist tradition, it was really about then what is it within myself that's coming and that interbeingness.
Yeah. Yeah. And then the last question, that's beautiful. It's such a powerful description of the word devotion, the way you're addressing the gods. And I know that there's that tension in Hinduism from just the externalization of follow this, 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 and this. But going back to the source, that's not where it started. It was more of the being very aware of every step of
Right.
the process, and that's an amazing connection. I feel like I could do a whole series just on you, because we could do Hinduism, we could do your experience as an immigrant, we could talk about the landscapes of queer in America today, and
Sure.
you're
Sure.
like at the crossroads of intersectionality in a very complicated multi-road intersection, three-dimensional. So anyways, but I'm getting off track. I just I know that you said you were mentioning you were involved in, I think I saw it today on Instagram, with an alliance of artists that is really trying to navigate how to bring their art into the cultural and political debate now, and try to. I'm just think if you could talk a little bit about that, because artists are, I think they often, and not just artists, anybody is kind of sometimes torn between pursuing something and also building a community to do that in the aim of helping something, and you're navigating all these spaces in your thought and your education and your mentorship, your advocacy. So I just thought how you were navigating this with community activism right now.
Yeah, so I've been really lucky, having spent so much time in LA, I was able to be a part of a couple of different spaces. I'd maybe name two different spaces that have been really helpful for me, particularly within the arts. One is this collective of South Asian artists from writers, directors, filmmakers, visual artists. It's a pretty amazing group of people,
Okay.
and with people and some people that I go deep with who are like family at this point to me, and others that I've never met before. So it's also for me not being in LA. It's been fun to be still connected to my family and my community in LA
Yes.
through this space, and it's really and there's a group of it's really led and fed by South Asian for Black Lives Matter,
Mm-hmm.
queer South Asian artists and activists who are really trying to figure out how do we not just support Black people in the work, but also how do we also do our own work?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
In dismantling the impact of colonization and
Right.
colonialism and the
Right.
ways that anti-blackness and white supremacy and white
Mm-hmm.
privilege have been embedded into the way we think about our own cultural identities and values, whether
Mm-hmm.
it's colorism, whether it's education, linguicism, etc.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that's been I did not realize how much I needed that,
Mm-hmm.
because it has been a space to have honest conversations with others who are also have similar identities, so I don't have to explain a lot of the complexities that you named just a while ago. And yet at the same time also we come from such different experiences that like it's actually a pretty incredible
Mm-hmm.
source of wisdom and insights and complexity and contradiction that can all coexist, which is for me I think the ultimate from a Hindu perspective, that's the ultimateness of pluralism, right? To be able to
Yes.
actually be at
Yes.
odds and still coexist,
Yes.
and to be able to name it and to be able to sit with it. Um, so that has been really cool to just have a space every week to get together with artists, and there's a couple of different. There's some folks who are writers and filmmakers, and they're working on a couple of projects. There's another set of us who are more healers and dancers and artists. And so we're actually creating a couple of different books and projects of thinking
It's
about
amazing.
how do we not just talk about anti-blackness in this theoretical realm, but how do
Right.
we actually take it? And it's easy to talk about it with other, with black people and maybe even some white people, but it's harder to talk about it with other brown people.
Right.
So how do we
Right.
actually do our own work within our own community? Because that's where we have to actually we have both
Mm.
agency and
Yeah.
also we have more to risk because
Yeah.
it's our community, it's our family, it's our parents, it's our siblings, it's our
Wow.
communities. And so that has been really inspiring to see just the wisdom, but also the creativity that's building on top of each other,
Mm-hmm.
and how we're making sense of this moment for ourselves, but also in contextualizing what it means to exist within this larger black-white dichotomy of U.S. racial
Yeah.
consciousness.
Yeah.
And then the other piece has been East West Players, which is an Asian American theater company based
Mm.
in LA,
Yeah.
in Little Tokyo. It's the oldest Asian American theater company, one of the oldest people of color theater companies in the country.
Wow.
Um,
Wow.
and I had the privilege of performing there years ago in one of their first shows that talked about intersectionality of LGBT identity and Asian identity and
Mm-hmm.
how we sit with that. And now I've been able to actually do a couple of series for them. We did a discussion series on how do we talk about anti-blackness within Asian communities, and
Wow.
then actually today we're airing a discussion that I had a couple of weeks ago with about 13 different artists, filmmakers, story
Wow.
writers, playwrights about how they and it was a group of pretty diverse group of not just Asian people, but we had African American folks, white folks,
Mm-hmm.
um, people from the diaspora talking about what does this
Wow.
mean for us as artists? How do we make and how is our art a source of healing and not just a source of distraction?
Right.
Um,
Right.
and that for me, I think that's been the theme of both of those spaces is the source of that and the healing that's possible in those
Yeah.
spaces.
Well, I want to thank you again. And one of the things I've always admired about you, but I think it's just becoming like I think Thich Nhat Hanh uses this as well about the lotus flower continually unfolding. So the lotus
Yes.
flower that you are continually unfolding into who you are, if I'm not too confusing there. But what I've always admired is your ability to be thinking of the spiritual and the mindful in context, but then the political and the activist. And many times that's difficult because we can get kind of maybe lost in one or the other. So I really want to congratulate you on the book. We're going to have a link below for people to check it out. And I hope you'll keep us up to date and come back and talk about some more things. I was just watching the other day that there is already a COVID temple in India that a person
Oh,
set
right,
up to the
right,
COVID, the coronavirus,
right.
and he performs rituals every day. So Hindu is incredibly pluralistic, of course. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Thank you so much, James. I so appreciate the opportunity to, one, just reconnect with you. It's been too long.
yeah,
Hopefully, we won't wait another 11 years
yeah,
until we
and
connect again.
another. Let's not
And
wait another pandemic either.
exactly. And
Yeah,
thank you for creating this platform and for helping to share this story. And like you said, what I connected to the lotus, Thich Nhat Hanh says, no mud, no lotus. And that's
no mud,
something
no
that's
lotus.
actually one of the first pieces that I did.
Yes,
That's somewhere in storage. But it's the reminder that we often want to celebrate the lotus, but we often don't recognize that the mud is what allows the
right,
lotus to bloom,
right.
and that the lotus then becomes the mud.
Yes,
And so for me, I
yes,
think the pandemic is both the mud and the lotus because it's
yes,
allowing us to actually
yeah,
be aware of the inequities that exist in our world,
yep,
and also allows us to actually do something and find the ability to actually find stillness in the chaos. I think
yeah,
those are so beautiful,
yeah.
and the fact that we are able to talk,
It's incredible.
halfway across the world from each other.
Yeah, and the fact that both of our projects came out of this Corona mud, it's very interesting too.
Exactly.
So
Exactly.
I know you probably are late for your meeting, and please apologize to them for me. But thank you so much for spending time. This is a great conversation, and I really appreciate the work. I encourage everyone to check out your book. And if you're new to the channel, please do subscribe and like and share the video. It really helps us out. And again, thank you for talking about your life and your journey and your book, Coloring in Consciousness.
Thank you, James.